right, Buzz Killers, it's me as Professor Buzzkill, busting myths, taking names. But as I always say, fortunately for you, we have an actual historian on the line. We have Dr. Natalia Mehlman Petrzela on the line, on the computer, on the Zoom, and she's come on the show for the first time to talk about her new book, Fit Nation. Professor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for being a new guest.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
This book is so important. The University of Chicago Press has it out, and it's just come out. The subtitle is called The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession. And I read this with just eyes wide open because I didn't know the detail of all this stuff, even though 90% of it happened in my lifetime. I didn't know how deep all this stuff was and how much was going on and all the different actors and sort of interested parties involved in the changes in the fitness industry in the United States. How did you conceive of this book?
It's a great question. So, as a historian, I sort of always move through the world with the question in my mind of how did we get here?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I am always thinking that at the grocery store when I'm watching the news. And that question animated this work. And I remember a particular moment. I was walking in Los Angeles. It was in the evening. I looked up and there was this gym and I could see into the window and there were all of these treadmills lined up and all these people huffing and puffing away and not looking very happy. And I remember thinking like, wow, we live in this cultural moment when people pay a lot of money and spend a lot of time and energy running in place to go nowhere. Like, what is that about? And so that was sort of one aha moment where I'm like, I want to study this. But then the kind of bigger picture context, which is not just one moment at all, is that for a good amount of time, I really almost had this sort of double life where I was pursuing my PhD and, my life as a scholar, but I was sort of this like secret gym rat. And despite a very unathletic childhood, I had like fallen in love with group fitness and with working out. And I was very much in that world. And I think that, I realized like this is both an incredibly powerful, wonderful place, but it's also a place that's like sort of problematic. And as a scholar, I'm like, I want to understand that more. And there really wasn't a lot of scholarship doing that work. And so that's like the big picture context of how it came to be.
Well, we want to get back to that. There isn't much scholarship on it because I want, at the end of the show, because I'd like to know what it's like to be a pioneer in a certain field. And we should tell the Buzz Killers that one of the best parts of the book actually is the author's note in which you explain that transformation that you're talking about, working on your PhD, but then also getting into the fitness scene, or scenes, I should say, plural. But Professor, I don't want to give away too much of the book because we want Buzzkillers to get it, especially American Buzzkillers, especially those of us who, have lived through all this stuff. So I thought today, if you wouldn't mind talking mostly about part one, because I was shocked to find that the book starts really in 1893. And I have to give this out. The title to part one, which is 4 chapters, is When Sweating Was Strange. Now, this is one of the great titles in a book full of great titles. But anyway, please take us back to 1893 and how this all happened.
Yeah, as a 20th century historian, definitely pushing myself, at least 7 years earlier than my usual time frame. And honestly, I could have, if I'd had 800 pages, I could have gone back even earlier. But I started in 1893 at the World's Fair in Chicago because there was this really evocative scene, I think, that kind of crystallizes some attitudes about exercise at the time. And so it starts with this famous strongman, Eugene Sandow, who's on stage and he's like flexing and posing like a classical Greek statue. And people love it. Like they are packing in crowds night after night to see him flex and perform and, sometimes kind of touch his rippling muscles. And there's all this
with gloved hands, though. The women wore gloves, you said, in the book, which is amazing.
Totally. Well, he's like all powdered up. Very different from like the oiled bodybuilders today. But one of the things that is so interesting about it, multiple things, is that like that was a moment when somebody who is deliberately working out and showing off their body, those people are professional performers. And part of the reason that so many many people packed into those crowds was because it was really weird. Like strong men tended and strong women tended to be on stage with like bearded ladies, so-called Siamese twins, like so-called freaks of nature, because it was so weird and sort of outside of the norm to spend that much time working on your body. And so Sandow, so like that's just like a cool scene, right? Like we all know about the World's Fair. We often don't know about the presence of Eugene Sandow flexing there and what that meant in workout culture. But I think it both shows the kind of performance aspect of it. But then I also go into like Sandow being one of the foremost people who's kind of trying to show that strength training is like not only good, but it's normal and it's aspirational. And the way he writes about it shows so clearly like the strength of the attitudes that he's up against. And so he's constantly saying like, I am not a mere breaker of stones. Like it is not just that I can lift heavy things. I deliberately train my body. I deliberately engage in this kind of like intelligent regimen, which, and I won't give too much away, is proof of the supremacy of the white race. And he talks about the difference, the importance rather, of white respectable people who are working more and more in kind of desk jobs, strengthening their bodies deliberately to offset the physical strength and honestly the ability to procreate of freed slaves, of new immigrants who are having bigger families who are coming from Europe. And so that resonates with an American audience. And interestingly, he's not American himself. He is Jewish from Prussia. So, but there's a reason it takes off in the US. But I think when Sweating Was Strange, it was weird, like something you pay to see somebody who lifts weights all the time and goes on stage displaying themselves. So not a lot of people were doing that.
Is it similar to in the sense that people went to these things as a spectacle because they didn't do that sort of thing? In other words, people go see great singers, partly just to enjoy the art of it, but they themselves cannot sing that well. So is it they go to see the strong men and et cetera because that's not part of their lives? Is that the strangeness of it?
Yeah, I think definitely. This is not something that any quote unquote normal person would really think to spend their time doing. So to see someone doing it is remarkable. Something that I think is worth noting too, there's some really great images I was lucky to be able to include in the book. And not to judge Eugene Sandow, but if you look at his body, like, yes, he has definition and he's strong, but honestly, he's like any other guy at the Equinox who's like lifting heavy. The sort of like what is a kind of superlative male strong body has shifted so much over the years that a guy like that, who's a global attraction, just doesn't look as, arresting as he did in 1893.
Yeah, and as people would say now, he doesn't look cut. He doesn't look ripped.
Not even close.
But perhaps most interesting in this chapter, or at least early in this part, is someone called the Lady Hercules. And I'd really like you to spend time on this because you draw out so many of the different meanings of the existence and the display of this woman, the Lady Hercules.
Yeah, so the Lady Hercules was Katie Brumbach. She actually changed her name to Katie Sanduina in order to kind of coast on Eugene Sandow's brand a little bit because she actually lifted heavier than him one day. So she called herself Katie Sanduina. And so she was a strong woman. And she would, since she was very young, like a toddler, she showed like a lot of physical strength, and her father kind of put her to work performing. She fell in love with this man, and they would go on stage together, and they performed on the circus circuit all over the United States, all over the world, really, as this duo. And she would like lift him up and flip him around and kind of like, show what was considered to be like a real reversal of gender roles. And people really love to see it. And so what I spend a good amount of time doing in the book is like unpacking what people love to see about it. And one of the most interesting things I found was the coverage of Sanduina's act by women who were pro-suffrage and who saw her as a kind of symbol of what could happen if women had a stronger place, not only in terms of their bodies, not really even in terms of their bodies, but in society. And so you see all of these articles that are written about like a world of Sanduinas is a world in which women are empowered. And then, of course, some fatalistic takes on that, where you have like this image of like a world of Sanduinas is one in which men have no power and like, are totally emasculated, and that kind of dystopic, anti-feminist vision, quite honestly. Now, all of that is interesting in terms of the symbolism of what she represented. But what I found also fascinating is that the people who actually went around to interview her found that she often didn't hold those same ideas about the symbolism of her strength. And there's one article I quote at length where this journalist who's very pro-suffrage goes to interview her, and she's like, so, what do you like to do in your spare time? And Sanduina is just giving her all of these answers, which are so incredibly deliberate. These answers are just meant to kind of like cut off at the knees the presumption that she's some kind of feminist. She's like, I just love housekeeping and cooking for my husband when I'm at home. And that's, these American women are kind of, so lazy around the house. And you just see this journalist kind of being deflated by this woman who she had positioned as this icon of suffrage. I will say Sanduina did change her tune soon after, and actually was instrumental in organizing circus women for the suffrage cause. And there's an interesting class dynamic there too, which I talk about, where there's this great scene where these circus women are organizing to get the vote. They're all working women, and they had this speaker who was supposed to come from one of the ladies' suffrage organizations who like totally poo-poos them and looks down on them and is like, oh, you women in your spangled outfits, and we don't really need you as part of our cause. And there's this real class tension there that I think kind of shows the way that a strong woman like Sanduina was seen as, not a respectable part of the feminist cause, even though her physical strength was so symbolically important.
But also, there's this great picture in the book of her. It's obviously a promotional picture. And what struck me immediately was they show her as a woman, as a tall woman. She's positioned next to three grown men who may have been a little on the short side to sort of enhance the difference in size. And she's clearly fit and in good shape, but they've put her in a woman's, I suppose that's a corset or it's the classic gender stereotypical clothing, including ladies' boots with heels. This is not exercise wear, and sure, her hair is done up and she has a flower in her hair, or at least a big bow in her hair. This is, and standing next to what seems almost like a baptismal font, again, with these three men on the left looking sheepish and small. I just think there must be so much in that one picture that you were able to analyze.
Yeah, I think, what the most kind of salient piece of that there is the way that she's dressed up in that kind of very frilly feminine clothing. Like that's something that comes back again and again. Like she's not coming out on stage dressed as like some kind of cave woman or what would have been called a savage at the time. She's always in these kind of trappings of very conventional feminine clothing. And I think that a lot of that has to do with, the kind of fine line that she was walking there, right? She's like really strong, like stronger than like any man, basically. But she's kind of trying to say, you can still be feminine and be strong like me. And that's a theme that like continues still to this day. If you look at like, I don't know, some CrossFit athletes or bodybuilders or some of the bodybuilding categories where it's all about you're like so strong and so ripped, but it's all about the makeup and the bikini and the tan, you still see some of that happening. Also, her race is really important in that regard. Like, a lot of people who are writing about her favorably talk about how, oh, she just has perfect proportions, but on a larger scale. And they talk about her as like her alabaster skin, a perfect model of like Prussian stock. Like it's very much that kind of early 20th century, like racial science, right? That's seeing her as like this example of white womanhood just on a larger scale. It could not be more different from the way that Black women and other women of color are talked about. Like, first of all, there are no Black women on stage performing in a kind of celebratory way. This is actually, and I don't actually talk about this in the book, but this is the age of like human zoos, right?
Sure.
This is the age when Black women are put on display like subhuman species. And you see in some of the commenting on circuses how women of color who are almost absent from stage shows are talked about in a very, very different way. So in many ways, it's kind of her whiteness that allows her to still maintain some of that sort of conventional and desirable femininity.
Well, then how does this sort of fit nation culture, exercise culture, strength culture sort of transform from being a spectacle that other people go see and not participate in to gradually becoming something that people do as a recreation and then as a sort of health improvement thing and as a way to become better, stronger, fitter Americans?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, some of it is related to changes in the economy and also in the food supply. So as you have an economy that is more reliant on service labor and people are less physically active
Right.
day to day, there arises this need to kind of do, what the exercise academics call purposive exercise. So like deliberately to go exercise because you're not getting that movement in your daily life. So that's
Right.
a major theme. That's a major theme over the course of the 20th century. But I think kind of like culturally or philosophically, and it's almost what interests me more, you also have this kind of shift from exercise being seen as something kind of narrowly physical and sort of seedy and kind of superficial to being something that is ennobling and self-actualizing and even part of being a good citizen. And those are two lines that I trace throughout the whole book. And so there are a series of policies actually really beginning with some of the PE, like the requirement of PE classes.
Physical education classes.
Physical education in the early 20th century, and then moving into the New Deal and programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which are celebrating having a strong body and using that strength for your nation, to the kind of 1950s and 60s when you have the presidents Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, who during the Cold War are celebrating physical fitness as kind of the way that every individual can strengthen America against the Cold War. Those are really key things that are happening throughout the first half or first 3/4 of the 20th century. And at the same time then, so you're getting this marriage of fitness as a civically positive activity with this thing that was just seen as purely physical before. But also with that, there's this shift that happens really powerfully in the 1960s in particular, where this notion that mind and body are interconnected and that it is individual people's responsibility to take control of their health, that is this paradigm shift that actually really changes the place of exercise in American society. And it's also, and this is so important, super resonant across the political spectrum. That to me is so fascinating. So let me give you an example of this. So for example, you have people who are kind of progressives or even radicals or counterculturalists, and they see the notion that mind and body are interconnected and that it's up to them to kind of take control of their own health as this really powerful form of self-determination. Like this is about telling this technocratic kind of masculinist, industrial, medical establishment, no, don't tell me because you have a white coat that you know what's better for my body. I'm going to take control of that. And that's really powerful for marginalized groups, particularly women, but also a lot of people of color. On the other end of the political spectrum, you have libertarians and kind of hardcore conservatives who are like, oh yeah, personal responsibility, I'm all about it. You don't wait for a government handout. You don't wait for someone to give you a pill to pop to feel better. It's up to you to make yourself feel better through willpower and discipline and all the rest. And really that creates a huge kind of paradigm shift in American thinking, I think, and especially in attitudes towards exercise. And so you have things like jogging, like yoga, and others that more contemporary, like CrossFit, that really encapsulate that thinking and are appealing to people who actually disagree on a whole lot of other things. But they can both, as I say, and as is evident in the cover of my book, they can both kind of meet on the yoga mat.
Well, that's right. But how does it fit into the question of I mean, there's a long-standing argument. I don't necessarily agree with it. That one of the things that increases in the 20th century, one of the things that increases with industrialization and the office work is more leisure time. So you talk about the California beach body being born. You talk about, and then throughout the book, you talk about how the development of exercise industry is able to be so diverse because people are doing different things at different times. Is it also partly a question of some people in certain classes anyway, having more time to devote to this sort of thing?
Oh, for sure. I mean, class is such an important angle for this story. And yeah, absolutely. There's a version of this story which is purely one about people who have kind of leisure time to do fun things, whether that's join a tennis club or go jogging, or who have such sedentary white collar work that they feel they need to do these activities to kind of offset that physically. That is an undeniable and really important part of this story. The reason that, I mean, I'm not like a huge fan of like writing a book that's only about things that the upper class experiences. So I really thought a lot about like, well, what does that mean? That's kind of undeniable, but it's also unsatisfying to stop there. And so what I spend a lot of time doing is saying that despite the fact that this is the case, pretty much everybody across the board in the United States feels the pressure to exercise today. But some people have a lot more means to do that. And I think that as exercise has evolved from being not just something like imposed on you to like discipline your body, but as something that most people agree is kind of like universally good for you, one of the things I think is so important is understanding why it is that people who are poorer have less access to exercise, and most importantly, to exercise on their own terms. Like if you are somebody who's affluent, oh, you can go to this gym or this fun class, and oh, it's Saturday morning, etc. If you're somebody who works shift labor and lives far away, or doesn't have a car and like lives far away from a park, etc., your choices and ability to do this are really constrained. And so I think that that's kind of an important part of this story too.
Yeah, you talk about exercise deserts throughout the country where I can't remember the figure, but it's like someone who lives more than a mile or half a mile away from any sort of park or open space is automatically marginalized in this way.
Yes. And I think that that is really important to think about because we talk about food deserts as we should. But I think that this idea of a kind of fitness desert, which no one really talks about, is really, really important because it's really, really important. And I think it's rarely talked about because we're so used to thinking about fitness as a private commodity and a private good. Right. And that's something I talk about a lot. So like, you don't necessarily think the reason someone doesn't exercise is because they don't have a well-lit park nearby, because we tend to think, oh, didn't you like buy that device to have at home or you belong to a gym, etc. And that's where most of the provision of exercise in this country really happens, is through private industry. But I personally think, and this is borne out by plenty of research, if we had a more concerted commitment to having, accessible recreation spaces that are well lit, that are safe, that are set up with, well-maintained like sports and fitness places, that's really, along with physical education in public schools, that's really where you start to have a real fit nation, not just a country where everyone feels the pressure to exercise, but very few people can do it, and even fewer in a way that's joyful.
Well, this is a good place for us to take a little break. My corporate overlords will put some ads in here. I hope some of them are related to fitness and good nutrition. And we'll be back in a second. Okay, we're back with Dr. Natalia Mehlman Petrzela, who's here to talk to us about Fit Nation, one of the most important books in American history to come out recently, in my view. Professor, before we left, we were talking about how this sort of exercise culture and recreation culture develops early in the 20th century, but it seems to me sort of after the war, and particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, it really becomes commercialized, and there's a sort of competition between different gyms and different types of things, even slimming devices you can have at home, and even things where you can lie down and not do any exercise, and the stimulating things are supposed to reduce your belly, and all kinds of, because it's really the commodification of exercise and fitness. It seems to be a huge deal, really starting in the 60s.
Oh, absolutely. So, one of the things that is kind of sad and the missed opportunity is that for the first half of or 60 years of the 20th century, there really is a lot of kind of, public and policy energy energy around promoting fitness. Like
Mm-hmm.
the infrastructure doesn't really totally come along with it, but there's this sense that that's the responsibility of the country, of the federal government to do that, and of the public sphere. They do a lot of really important philosophical groundwork, as I explained, in terms of like sanitizing exercise and making it seem like really wholesome and a positive and virtuous thing to do. But it's really the private industry that runs with it in the
Yeah.
60s and until the current day. And it is, I mean, this is one of the most fun things about this book, although it was sad and I had to cut a lot of great stories out of it. But like the amount of just like capitalist production around
Yeah.
exercise is just so over the moon. I mean, to give you a sense, hopefully you'll buy the book and read more about these things, but everything from these like luxury health palaces that had like tropical fish tanks, and everyone wanted carpeting, like wall to wall carpeting, which is so gross in a gym. I don't know who would
Exactly.
want
Yeah.
that.
Exactly.
They all advertise
Yeah.
that.
Dance studios don't have carpeting; they have hardwood
No,
floors.
it's so
Right.
gross.
Yeah.
Except for bar studios, which like a close bar aficionado and reader will remember.
Uh-huh.
But that, and these like slimming salons
Mm-hmm.
where women who were like, people wanted to sell them exercise, but it was seen as unladylike to sweat. And so these like big vibrating machines that they would be on, these new bar classes that were actually very sexual in the cues that they were given. Like there's just the, not to mention all the like home devices that you could buy
Mm-hmm.
to do this stuff at home, the relaxicizer. I mean, it's just like on and on and on. And some of them are more scammy than others. Like I talk about this magic couch in there, and like the
Yeah,
FTC,
that's right. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
legislation, the FTC case around it. That's Federal Trade Commission. And so to me, like, I mean, there's just like a lot of cool stories in there. And I hope everybody who reads them will kind of see their work out differently. But I think one of the main takeaways from that kind of pastiche of devices and gyms and all the rest is just like this became an industry, and
Yeah.
people became aware that there was something to sell and people were buying. And I talk about this moment on Muscle Beach in Southern California in the late 1950s, where, there was a stage, not unlike Sandow's stage, where these very acrobatic and muscular men and women do these performances. And I say like, and all these people would crowd around and watch. And I'm like, that was like the end of an era when people could watch that and not feel like, oh, I should be working out.
Exactly.
By the
Yeah.
1960s, the seed of that feeling is planted. And since then, it has only spread.
Yeah. Well, and even things like the NASA programs, the astronauts are shown as being fit. And, and they're the type of people that Americans should emulate, and on and on and on. But what intrigues me so much is I kind of wonder how big businessmen at the time are convinced that you can make money from this. I mean, I can imagine myself, in 1970 saying, well, what do you mean? This running trend, people are just going outside running. That maybe the running shoe business is a new thing, but no one's going to go indoors to a gym and run on a treadmill. I don't want to invest my money in that. How is that sort of antique notion just torn down?
Well, it takes a long time to tear that down.
Yeah.
And the fact that there weren't sort of like, accomplished business people bought into this idea that like fitness is something worth investing in helps explain why so many of these businesses go belly up. I mean, well into the 1980s, there was this presumption like nobody wanted gyms as tenants, not only because they often attracted kind of seedy people, but a lot of them would sell advanced memberships and then never open. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of like shady business practices, or not even shady always, but just kind of shoddy business practices, I should say. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that if you look at those early gym chains, a lot of them come from like enthusiasts. Like it's a guy like Vic Tanny, for example, who I talk about a lot, who built a whole chain of kind of health spas, which had a lot of kind of financial issues. I mean, he was a bodybuilder and he was very smart to see what could come from that. But that was not like a huge business success story for him. And so the ones that make it huge, like somebody like Judy Shepard-Massett and Jazzercise, I mean, that becomes a huge business. It's a franchise. I mean, she's the first one to tell you she's very smart and a phenomenal dancer, but she was a little bit like it was a little bit of luck that pushed her to make a franchise model, which ended up being an absolutely fantastic decision. That business is still around today.
Yeah.
But you do find that, I think you're right. A lot of people were not going to invest in this. And so you have a sort of like Wild West situation where a lot of the people who are making money, and some of them really building solid businesses, I don't want to underplay that, but a lot of them are like coming out of the gym world kind of themselves. And so they don't come from a business background. That takes a while to change. I mean, you definitely have big real estate investors in the 80s and 90s who are building out some of these big health clubs, which become all the rage, that have, like, I talk about tanning beds and rock walls and all lazy rivers and like all of these things. So the real estate people investing in it. But I even remember in my lifetime, like with the boutique studio phase of the kind of early 2000s, like there definitely was this jumping off point where all of these often women entrepreneurs who had essentially started studios, like there was this moment, and I would say between 2005 and onwards, when like honestly a lot of like male investors were like, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. And there was this whole raft of private equity investment and so forth. And I'm not saying, oh, phew, these like business people swooped in and knew what they were doing. Like, I actually don't think that's true. And there's been a big cost to that. But it is notable in terms of like the prestige and the sense of what could be profitable in the fitness industry, that it wasn't seen as like a serious space for a long time until it was.
But then on the other hand, first of all, so many of these things seem to longstanding consumers like fads. Now, jazzercise, you're right, has been around for a long time. But there's jazzercise, then there's step aerobics, then there's this, then there's that, and there always has to be a new thing for that. And yet, into the 21st century, it seems to me, into the 20th century and into the 21st century, two things happen. The YMCA, YWCA thing declines, right? Or that had been previously the place to go. I'm not doing necessarily every YMCA and every YWCA declines, but it's replaced by things like, well, in my own city of Pittsburgh, the Jewish Community Center, which everyone in the East End, the sort of, upper class part of town, goes to the JCC. Now, the JCC has within it, private companies that come in and set up classes and all sorts of other things. But this sort of nonprofit entity is in lots of cities in the country, including out in Denver, where a lot of my family lives. The place to go is the JCC. They're seen as the cutting edge. The best squash courts in Pennsylvania are in the JCC. And I just find that very, very interesting that it's nonprofits that are really coming, or at least in my experience, nonprofits are the places to go. And it had become fashionable.
Yeah, I think, first of all, fitness is pretty localized. So, different communities have really different experiences. Yeah, YMCAs are definitely kind of where it started. I would say that JCCs are as much part, and I started, by the way, my first step class where I discovered this love of group fitness was at a JCC in Newton, Massachusetts. So I'm with you on that. But I do think that, what you're describing is like the best squash courts, the best facilities. They have these private contractors. That speaks not so much to a rise of nonprofits offering this stuff, which isn't insignificant, but also of like almost like a higher bar for a consumer experience that is happening, right? Like YMCAs, like not all of them. I've been to some pretty nice YMCAs, but they tend to be sort of like, bare bones, right? Like you've got equipment and they're affordable for the most part. What we have seen, certainly since the 1980s, but I'd say since the 1980s, is this rising bar on the desire for fitness to be a kind of luxury experience, something that moves from being something you do behind the scenes to like get fit to like live the rest of your life, to in itself being a social space, in itself being a place for status signaling, et cetera. And so I'm sure some JCCs are less nice than some YMCAs, et cetera. But I would say that the theme that we're seeing there is actually like, okay, private contractors giving a nicer experience, slightly better facility, and kind of raising the bar on what people are paying and what people are expecting out of their gym experience.
But do you think, sorry to continue down this one thread, but do you think that certain people also think by going to the JCC, by paying a little bit of extra money, over the YMCA or other places, I'm also contributing to a worthy cause. The JCC also
Sure.
has free daycare, also does all sorts of wonderful philanthropic things. It just seems like you're going to a better place than to Fitness Nation or some other place that's just in it for the money.
Yeah, well, there's no question. I mean, exercise as part of like a virtuous circle is a really
Right. Yeah, okay.
powerful cell,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
exercising itself is virtuous, but there is still this little twinge, I think, and a totally understandable one that, oh, this feels kind of selfish, like
Yeah.
this feels kind of indulgent. And so if you are going to take your exercise, not only for you, but like you're saying, paying into a nonprofit like the JCC, or there are 8 zillion kind of like, exercise for a cause kind of programs, whether it's walking for breast
Yeah,
cancer or
right.
doing a class that like pays forward money to some other cause. Like, I think that that is really powerful for 2 reasons. One, it sort of fits in with exercise that a lot of people think of as like also like a virtuous thing,
Mm.
but almost contradictorily, it offsets the feeling that I do think a lot of people feel, which is like, oh, I feel guilty. I'm taking this time for me, or I'm spending money on this thing. And it's like, oh no, well, I'm paying it forward. So that is sort of interesting because there is that ambiguity or tension at the heart of what exercise means in America today. Is it just like virtuous and an uncritical good, or is it kind of an indulgent leisure pursuit?
And I think that's one of the reasons why you call part 7, the final part in the book, 5 chapters, and it's called "It's Not Working Out." And I think that we don't want to give that away because we want Buzzkillers to get the book. So but my final question to you, really, Professor, is, and this is sort of for the graduate students out there, for the other historians out there, for the other academics out there, which we have a number of whom are in our audience. What's it like being a pioneer in a topic field? This is not a topic that I would have thought, or that lots of people would have thought, a historian would have gotten into until much later. Now, as it's in the book, chock full of footnotes to sociology studies and all kinds of other academics working on these problems, but you're really breaking new ground here. What is that like in terms of just the workflow and the conceptual things that you have to deal with?
Thank you. That's such a kind thing to say. And of course, this is the moment where I shout out people like Shelley McKenzie or
Sure.
Harvey Green and, newer scholars like Ava Perkis, Danielle Friedman. Like, there are amazing people working on these topics who I draw on and who I feel greatly indebted to. I would say, though, that like if I'm going to be sort of self-important and say, okay, yeah, I am a pioneer, one of the things that I do feel is novel and was a little bit scary in doing this was not only taking on a topic that felt sort of new and had been sort of looked down on a little bit, I think, in the academy of like, oh, why would you study the gym? That's so
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
like base,
Sweaty.
or
Yeah.
yeah, sweaty, right? It's so like bodily, earthly, or if it was worthy of study, it's like, oh, well, that's just like another site for neoliberal oppression or patriarchy. And I think that
Right.
those things are true, but that's not the whole story. But I would say the part that I do feel sort of pioneering and I guess is that fitness culture, the fitness industry, like being in those spaces is such an important part of my life, not
Mm-hmm.
just a scholar, but as someone. I've worked at gyms for years as an instructor, as a front desk girl. I've worked in gyms. Some of my best friends are fitness
Right.
people in the industry who are not scholars at all, and I have been very open about that. And that is something that, as virtuous as exercise is seen to be in our larger culture, was, particularly when I was untenured, like a little nerve wracking for me as a
Sure.
woman who was like teaching effectively aerobics classes. I'm like, how am I going to be taken seriously? And it really was a kind of like leap for me to say, like, this is really important to me. And I'm not letting up in any way on the kind of traditional forms of achievement or production in our field, but I'm also not going to deny that this is an important part of who I am. And I'm going to be open about that. And so on social media and on other places, like you'll see me posting about an article I wrote, but I'm also posting about like, come take a class with me.
Right.
And that is scary. I do think that in this being my second book, so it's like my post-tenure book, I have a little bit of freedom, a little bit more freedom than I did with my dissertation. But that being said, or not that being said, but because of that, in some ways, because I think I'm working on a topic that like some folks are a little bit skeptical of, my advice would be, or at least telling you what I did, is like, I always want to be sure I am clearing the highest bar for scholarly seriousness.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
There is a reason I am so thrilled that this is coming out with University of Chicago Press, fully peer-reviewed, phenomenal academic editor. Like, it's written very accessibly, but I'm like, don't tell me this is some silly little fitness book because it's cleared all these things. And, that's not just kind of for show, but I think the book in this research is much better because I have been publishing in academic journals, doing that peer review, et cetera. And so to me, both is a form of sort of, careerist self-protection. Like, yeah, you want to make sure you have all those accolades and all those things that count, especially when you're doing something that may seem a little outside the norm. But I also think it's important to just realize like what fires you up every day and what you want to do as a human being, not just as a scholar. And I think that's really animated me to get this book done. Hopefully other people will agree it's a good book, and to do it honestly in a kind of joyous way. I mean, it's hard to write this book, but it's also felt like such a privilege that people share their stories with me, that I could write this, that I could do this work. So I hope other people like it too. And I hope that kind of story about blending the personal and the professional, some gives you a little something to think about.
Well, I think that I think it does, and it clearly through the book you can see that. But let's not shortchange the comprehensiveness of the book and the depth of the scholarship. And as you say, this University of Chicago Press, Press is, famously hard-nosed about, you got 8,000 footnotes, the whole thing. And what I think is so, what's going to interest the buzzkillers so much, you talk about yoga and counterculture, Title IX and its limits, the new gospel for fitness, and strong is the new skinny. There's a great chapter called Eat, Pray, Buy. I love that, the sort of Lululemon chapter, and on and on and on and on. And Buzzkillers, please, if you're one of our Patreon members, watch it in your email, because we're going to offer a copy of this book that is so important to American culture and so important to the 21st century. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Professor, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. What a privilege to come on. And thanks for your kind words on the book and reading so thoughtfully.
Oh, yes. Completely captivating. And Professor, I noticed that you're one of the historians who's going to be in this new book called Myth America, coming out in January, the most important book ever related to our show. And we're going to devote the whole month to it. We're hoping, I'm praying, I'm getting on my knees now, that you'll come on and do an interview about your chapter in that book.
You can count on it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Buzzkillers, there you have it. Go to the Buzzkill Bookshelf. The book is there, and we'll talk to all of you next week.